The sun hung low over the wide plains, washing the world in gold. Wind slid through the tall grass and over the rails of a weathered ranch, where a man named Ethan Cole lived alone. His house was solid and quiet, built by his hands years ago, when he still believed life would stay kind. He had lost his wife to illness, and most of his laughter with her. Since then, the sound of hooves, the clatter of gates, and the whisper of the wind were the only voices he knew. He did his chores, fixed fences, and spoke to the horses because no one else was there to listen. The nearest town was miles away, a cluster of wooden buildings that filled with noise and drink every Saturday night. Ethan went there only when he had to sell cattle or buy feed. He preferred silence. It hurt less than company. One hot afternoon, he rode into town to trade. The air smelled of dust and whiskey. As he tied his horse near the saloon, he heard shouting a rough voice, slurred and angry. A man staggered out onto the street, waving his arms. Beside him stood a thin young girl, no more than 17. Her hair tangled, her face pale, her eyes hollow. The man shouted, "Who wants her?" "She can't hear a word. Good for nothing. Eats like a horse and works like a snail. Someone give me $5 and take her off my hands." The crowd laughed nervously and turned away. Ethan felt something cold settle in his chest. He had seen cruelty before, but this was different. The man grabbed the girl by the arm, and she flinched but didn't make a sound. Ethan stepped forward and said quietly, "Let her go." The drunk squinted at him. "What's it to you, rancher? You want her? Give me $5. Ethan stared at the girl. She stood still, eyes fixed on the ground, her hands trembling. Something in that silence, so deep, so heavy, made him reach for his wallet. He counted out $5 and handed them over. The man grinned, pocketed the money, and stumbled away. Ethan turned to the girl and said, "Come on." She looked up, uncertain, then followed him. They rode back to the ranch in silence. She didn't speak, didn't even hum. When he tried to ask her name, she just looked at him, confused. He guessed she really was deaf. When they reached the house, he gave her the small spare room near the kitchen, showed her where the well was, where the animals were kept, and left her be. That night, he sat by the fire, wondering what he had done. He had no family, no plans for one, and now a stranger, one who could not hear, was sleeping under his roof. Still, something about her eyes kept coming back to him. They were frightened, but not empty. There was life hidden somewhere in them. Days turned into weeks. The girl, whom he learned was named Anna, from a note sewn into her dress, worked quietly around the ranch. She swept floors, fed chickens, and helped cook without being told. She never smiled, but her movements were careful and gentle. The animals liked her. Even the old dog, Duke, who barely trusted anyone, followed her wherever she went. Ethan started leaving notes for her, short and simple. Water the garden, milk in the shed. She understood quickly and even began leaving notes back. Done. Thank you. Little by little, the silence between them began to feel less heavy. One evening, while repairing the fence, Ethan dropped his hammer and it hit a metal post with a loud clang. He saw Anna turn her head sharply at the sound. He froze. She shouldn't have heard that. He tested again later, deliberately, letting the door slam again. She flinched. Something stirred in his mind. Maybe she wasn't deaf after all. Maybe she only pretended to be. But why? A few nights later, as she was washing dishes, Ethan spoke softly from behind her. "Anna." She stiffened. The plate slipped from her fingers and shattered. For a moment, she didn't move. Then she slowly turned, eyes wide, lips trembling. Ethan's voice was gentle. "You heard me, didn't you?" Tears filled her eyes. She shook her head, then whispered, "Please don't tell." It was the first time he'd ever heard her speak. Her voice was rough from disuse, fragile like glass. Ethan said softly, "I won't tell." "But why?" Anna looked down. "My father told everyone I was deaf. He said people would pity me and leave us alone. When I grew older, he said no man would marry a deaf girl so he could keep me near to work for him. When I tried to say I could hear, he beat me and said I was lying." Ethan's hands tightened around the table's edge. He wanted to curse the man, but knew it wouldn't change anything. "You're safe here," he said finally. "You don't have to lie anymore." From that day forward, Anna began to change. She no longer pretended not to hear. Sometimes she hummed while she worked, a trembling tune that filled the house with warmth. She smiled shyly when Ethan complimented her cooking. Slowly, the ranch began to feel alive again. Birds nested near the windows. The old dog barked again. Even Ethan found himself whistling on his way to the barn. One evening, heavy clouds gathered over the plains. Thunder rolled in the distance. Ethan was checking the horses when he realized Anna was missing. He found her crouched behind the barn, trembling. Lightning flashed, and she covered her ears, sobbing. He ran to her and knelt beside her. "It's just a storm," he said gently. She shook her head. "He used to lock me outside when it stormed," she whispered. "Said the thunder would teach me to listen." Ethan's heart twisted. He put his arm around her shoulders. "No one will ever do that again." She leaned against him, crying quietly until the storm passed. After that night, something new grew between them, a quiet bond built from trust. Anna began to talk more, telling small stories about her mother, who had died when she was a child, about how she used to sing, though her father hated it. Ethan listened to every word. For years he had forgotten how to listen to another human voice. Now he could not get enough of hers. Autumn came. The trees on the ridge turned gold and red, and Anna often sat on the porch at sunset, watching the light fade. One evening she asked softly, "Do you ever get lonely?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Used to, not so much now." She looked at him, her eyes warm. "Me neither." That simple exchange said more than either could express. As the nights grew colder, they spent more time by the fireplace. Ethan read aloud from an old book, and Anna would listen, sometimes resting her head on her hands, sometimes closing her eyes as if tasting every word. When he stopped reading, she said, "You have a good voice." He chuckled. "It's the only one I've got." She smiled. It was the first time he had seen her smile fully, and it lit the room brighter than the fire. The peace didn't last forever. One morning, a rider came from town, a deputy wearing a dusty badge. He handed Ethan an envelope. Inside was a letter from a lawyer saying Anna's father had died in a tavern fight. With it came a notice that Anna's late mother had left a small inheritance, money sitting untouched in a county bank. Anna stood silent as Ethan read it to her. When he finished, she said quietly, "So it's over." Ethan asked what she would do. She thought for a long moment. "I don't know. I've never been anywhere else." That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat by the window staring at the stars, wondering if she would leave. He told himself he wanted her to go, to have a new life, a better one. But the thought of the ranch without her felt unbearable. The next morning, he found her by the gate with a small bag. His heart sank, but before he could speak, she said, "I'm not going anywhere. I just wanted to see how it feels to stand on the road and choose to stay." He let out a slow breath. You sure? She nodded. This is home now. For the first time in years, Ethan smiled wide and true. The sun broke through the clouds. The horses grazed lazily in the field, and the ranch that once echoed with emptiness was filled with life again. He didn't buy a deaf girl that day in town. He found a soul that could finally hear, and in helping her, he learned to listen to his own heart once more. The winter that followed was kinder than the ones before. The wind still howled across the plains, but inside the ranch there was warmth. Ethan repaired fences in the barn, while Anna read by the fire, her soft voice sometimes filling the air as she practiced reading aloud. Each evening they shared supper, speaking little but feeling everything. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was full of peace. When the snow began to thaw, Ethan felt a quiet joy that surprised him. He had lived for years just waiting for the days to pass. But now every sunrise seemed to matter. In early spring, a letter arrived. It carried news from the town's lawyer that Anna's inheritance had matured enough to buy new land or start a business. Ethan handed her the letter, unsure what she would decide. She sat by the window for a long time, staring at the hills beyond the ranch. Finally, she said, "Money can build a house, but not a home. I already have one." Ethan tried to argue that she should have her own choices, but she smiled and said, "I just made one." Weeks later, they rode into town together for supplies. People who once whispered about the lonely rancher and the deaf girl now greeted them with respect. Anna walked with quiet confidence. She helped an old woman cross the street, spoke kindly to the children who ran past, and when someone asked if she really used to be deaf, she only smiled and said, "I learned to listen." Ethan watched her with quiet pride. That summer was full of work. The herd grew, the garden thrived, and the ranch seemed alive in a way it never had before. One afternoon, a traveling teacher stopped by, offering lessons to anyone who wanted to learn reading or arithmetic. Anna surprised Ethan by joining. Each evening, she studied by lamplight, tracing words with her finger. Ethan teased her gently about it, but secretly he admired her determination. She said learning made her feel like she could build her own future. And Ethan told her that was exactly what she was doing. When harvest season came, neighbors gathered at the ranch to help bring in hay before the storms. For the first time in years, laughter echoed across the yard. There was food, music, and stories. Late into the night, Anna played with the children, teaching them songs she remembered from her mother. Ethan sat on the porch, listening to her laughter mix with the sound of the wind through the trees, and thought he had never heard anything so beautiful. But life on the plains always carried trials. In the fall, a wildfire broke out miles away, spreading fast across the dry grass. Smoke filled the air, and the wind pushed the flames toward the ranch. Ethan and Anna worked side by side, digging trenches and soaking the ground near the barns. They fought all night, coughing and sweating under an orange sky. At dawn, the fire finally turned away, leaving the horizon black, but the ranch still standing. Exhausted, Anna collapsed by the well, and Ethan lifted her into his arms. "You saved this place," he said. She shook her head, smiling faintly. "No, we saved each other." The months after the fire were hard but full of gratitude. The land slowly healed, green shoots rising from the ashes. Ethan rebuilt fences and Anna painted. The house felt bright again, almost new. Each day brought small joys, a newborn calf wobbling on uncertain legs, the smell of rain after long dust, the quiet comfort of coffee shared without words. The silence that once weighed heavily on Ethan now felt gentle, even sacred. One clear morning, a wagon rolled up, carrying the traveling teacher who had visited before. She offered Anna a position at the town school, helping children who struggled to hear or to speak. Anna hesitated, her eyes drifting toward Ethan. He wanted to ask her to stay. The words nearly rose to his lips. But he saw the light in her expression, the same brave spark he had seen the first time she forced herself to speak aloud. "You should go," he said softly. "The world needs your kindness." Tears shimmered in her eyes. "So do you," she whispered. She left the following week, promising to return every weekend. The ranch felt quieter after that, but not empty in the same way. Ethan knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Often he rode into the hills, looking toward the distant town, picturing her guiding children to discover voices of their own. Letters arrived every few days. They carried small stories about students making progress, about shared laughter, about how she missed the wind sweeping across the open fields. Ethan kept each letter carefully tucked inside a wooden box. Time passed. One rainy evening, as he sat by the fire reading her latest note, he heard the sound of hooves outside. When he opened the door, Anna stood there, soaked through but smiling wide. "School's out for summer," she said breathlessly. "I couldn't wait any longer to come home." He looked at her for a long moment before stepping aside. "Then home it is," he said quietly. That night, they sat together by the fire, in the very place where everything between them had first begun. Rain tapped gently against the roof. Anna glanced around the room. "When I first came here, all I could hear was fear," she said softly. "Now I hear peace." Ethan swallowed, his voice thick with feeling. "And I hear hope." The next morning, sunlight spilled through the windows, warming the wooden floors and worn furniture. 2 cups of coffee steamed side by side on the table. Outside, the land stretched wide and alive. Duke barked happily. Horses grazed in the pasture. The wind carried the faint sound of Anna singing. In town, people still repeated the old story about the rancher who once bought a deaf girl from a drunk man. But those who truly knew them understood better. He hadn't bought her at all. He had found her, and in doing so, had found himself. And she hadn't been deaf. She had simply needed someone willing to listen. And so the ranch that had once echoed with silence, now echoed with life.